Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello again. For those of you I didn't meet earlier, I'm Wendy Chung. I'm a pediatrician and geneticist, and at the Simons Foundation, what they call the Director for Clinical Research. So we had a great afternoon for those of you who were able to attend the breakout sessions. I know for the sessions I was in, I just saw a lot of questions and we didn't have time to get to all of them. We really packed stuff in. So we've set this up as a fireside chat, although I think we're all looking for the fire so we can warm up a little bit. But so we've set this up as a panel discussion to continue the conversation. So we're going to take a little time introducing you to the panelists. We know everyone wasn't able to go to all the sessions, right? Because we had things going on concurrently. So now's our opportunity to cross-fertilize and go beyond what we were able to in the sessions. And we also have some viewers online, and so we'll have some of them potentially even asking questions as well. Okay, so as we do that, I'm going to ask you that we're going to give a little bit of introduction ourselves, and then we're going to open up and have plenty of time for questions coming from the audience. I am going to ask you, as you're asking those questions, try and think about how to ask maybe what might be a very personal question in a generalizable way so that other people can benefit from things that you might be thinking about. And we're not going to provide clinical advice in terms of any specific sort of your child should do this, that, or the other. I hope you've all got really great clinicians at home to be able to help you with those issues. Okay, so we're going to start off with Nate, and I'll let you go ahead, and we're going to introduce ourselves as we go around, and then we'll start some general discussion.
Great. Can you all hear me? Okay, yep, there we go. So I'm Nate Call. I'm a professor of pediatrics at Emory University School of Medicine, and I'm the Associate Division Chief for the Division of Autism-Related Disorders in the School of Medicine. I'm a psychologist by training and a BCBA-D, and my training and experience are primarily in the areas of addressing challenging behavior. So I work with a lot of individuals and a lot of families of kids who engage in behavior like aggression or self-injury, repetitive behavior, elopement, which we talked about in the earlier breakout group, so wandering away or running away from supervision, as well as toileting concerns, stuff like that. And so I'm really excited to be here. I like that Wendy said we're going to cross-fertilize because you know what you fertilize with, right? And that's what I have in abundance. So I'm really excited to share whatever I can.
Good.
Thank you. Nate paid me to laugh at his joke, so there you go. I'm Sharon Spurlock. I'm the Senior Director of Family Support at the St. Louis ARC. We support over 6,000 families that have a family member of any age with an intellectual or developmental disability, from prenatal diagnosis all the way through end of life. But I'm here because I am also part of the Charting the LifeCourse team through the University of Missouri, Kansas City University Center for Excellent Developmental Disability. And so in that role, I work with families, individuals, professionals, and state systems to learn about how to use this framework for thinking about how to plan and problem solve for all people. But my emphasis obviously is on planning for people with disabilities. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Charlotte.
I'm Charlotte Destefano. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm an assistant professor in the psychiatry department at the University of Southern California and Children's Hospital Los Angeles. I also started my career as a special ed teacher. So one of the things I focus on a lot in clinic is helping families navigate the special ed system. Research-wise, I focus on language and communication development in kids who are minimally verbal with autism, intellectual disability, certain neurogenetic syndromes. And what I talked about here today was the special ed process and also strategies for promoting communication.
And Tally.
Hi, I am Tally Foster. I am an occupational therapist. I work with children with complex medical and neurodevelopmental conditions, quite a variety. And I am also an educator at the University of St. Augustine in Florida as well for the doctoral program. I work primarily in pediatrics at this point. So my interest here and my kind of specialty area of interest is sensory processing, which is a big umbrella. And all the different things that fall into that. So I absolutely love working collaboratively with other professionals and other disciplines, and try to make that a point in my practice. So I'm very happy to be here as well. Thank you.
Okay, So the first question for each of the panelists, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer the question. In your session, what was one key take-home message? So if someone wasn't able to come to your session or it was overwhelming, what's the one thing you want them to go home remembering?
So in the session that I was in, we were talking again primarily about challenging behavior and what approaches folks can take to try to address challenging behavior. And it was really great because our panel had folks like me who have more of a background in behavioral strategies, but we also had someone from a psychiatric who could present from a psychiatric background and more medication and that type of thing, as well as Tally, who could talk about sensory processing. So for me, the thing that really came through loud and clear was that it takes multiple approaches and it's not really just one thing, right? That folks sometimes are able to identify medications that they might try to help address challenging behavior, but really that's going to be most effective when supplemented with other approaches as well, and vice versa, that just a strictly behavioral strategy that doesn't address any underlying medical concerns or doesn't address sensory processing is going to be less successful than if you try to really cover all your bases. And that can be tough to find clinicians and providers in your area that do all the things. But certainly there's a lot that can be done even just from as a parent standpoint to think about how you're approaching.
Sharon?
I'm going to take advantage. I sat in the other family support session prior to mine. So I feel like the big takeaway for me from listening to that session and also being able to engage with families in the second one is just that kind of overwhelming feeling most families have about getting it right and making sure that you know everything and that you have all the best connections and you have all the best resources. And I think that's a really overwhelming expectation for anybody to have. And so the speaker before me talked a lot about self-care, which I think is incredibly important. I think it's really important also to be able to distill information down and have some structure around how you find things out, how you make connections to people so that you can sort through that, and how you find resources. And so the tools that I offered were, I hope, a way to do that. But I think also finding your local resources. One of the things that we provide is family navigation. So we never expect families to know everything. We want you to know that you can reach out and then there'll be somebody to walk with you as you go through whatever issue you're trying to resolve in your family's life.
Great advice. Charlotte?
So my session was kind of in two segments. In the first part, we focused on the special education process. And I think probably the big takeaway there is knowing that you as a parent and your child have a lot of rights that are protected by federal laws. And it can be really, really overwhelming to understand all of those components. But if your child is not getting the supports and services that they need in the school environment, know that there are resources you can reach out to. There are people who can help you advocate, and you don't have to accept a program that isn't a good fit for your child's needs. In the second half, we focused on promoting communication. And I hope the big takeaway that came across there is that access to communication in whatever modality your child is capable of is really, really, really important. We never want to deny a child access to communication. Using some sort of alternative communication method like a speech output device does not inhibit spoken language development. In fact, the research shows us that it helps spoken language development over the long term. So we want to provide kids with whatever communication tools are going to meet them where they're at, so that they can really work on developing those communication skills over time.
Alan?
So I'm definitely going to agree with what Nathan said about the session we had on managing problem behaviors, that the collaborative component is so critical. I hope everyone can, I want to say, take it a little bit further if you can, or if you have not been able to, and make that connection for the people you work with. Make sure you can, even if you're providing copies of reports to each professional or however you can connect them, I think that's such a huge component. I find that very, very valuable, you know, when everybody's on the same page, but it can be some people are blessed to have everything connected, but every system is not. And sometimes you're searching in a lot of different places. and your children are receiving services a lot of different ways, or their educational settings and perhaps therapy settings, perhaps caregivers, and just connecting that is really important. My other big takeaway would be that I want everyone to think about all of the components of sensory processing that we all encounter every day, the things that come in, the things we manage, and how we respond to that. And so make sure we're considering those things for ourselves and for our children, and whoever we're helping, so that we can start the process of modifying anything that we need to help them get the best information and be as regulated as possible. But that's a journey, and it's not a simple answer. It's individual, and it takes some work, but there are a lot of great resources out there to start discovering what that is.
When I look around the room, I think of the conditions, the 4 conditions we're talking about today. And we're relatively early on in our understanding, is what I would say personally. That is, I think that we're all banding together to learn from each other, but these conditions have only been described for a few years, and so there's still a lot to learn. And I'm curious for each of you, if you have any advice in terms of families within this. You know, the sort of textbook isn't written in terms of how to do this. And so how do you navigate this space? And is there anything you're hopeful about, either in terms of by learning from each other, or technologies or strategies or services, anything that's on the horizon you can help us think towards and looking for? And again, we're still figuring this out. We're learning as we're going along. Anyone?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Charlotte.
I think one of the things that makes me really hopeful is the collaborations across different family groups in so many of these different syndromes. And just for my particular background, I work a lot with a syndrome called duplication 15q disorder, which shares some genetic background with another disorder called Angelman syndrome, which is much more well-known and well-established. And those 2 groups, Dup15q is much newer, Angelman syndrome is much more established. And through their collaborations, we've been able to really implement a lot of things with the newer group that the older group sort of learned from their own process and put in place. And then at our most recent family conference, we had a few even newer disorders that have some similar characteristics that came in and got to benefit from the more established groups and the lessons learned. So I think even though the groups here are fairly new and identified recently, you know, you share a lot with people who have gone before you and been through this journey already. And so I think those collaborations are really, really powerful.
Yep, absolutely.
In terms of research and kind of what's coming down the pike, I think that our research team, the team that I lead, is engaged in a lot of work trying to address kind of real world problems that families oftentimes encounter, especially around things like challenging behavior. So for example, and these are topics that have traditionally not really had a lot of research investment in them. And so I think about things like we have a clinical trial underway that's just wrapping up on kind of establishing best practices for toilet training, and toilet training specifically around bowel movements in particular, right? Like it's not, I always love going to a conference to talk about teaching kids to use the toilet, but you know, it's the kind of thing that I remember this stuff started when we were at our clinic, and we would have family show up and they said, well, our problem, their child was getting ready to receive a colostomy bag because he would get so constipated and he was having to be sedated every 3 weeks in order to clean him out because he would get so constipated. And it's the kind of thing that the family said, look, we get that you have kids here who are doing really difficult things, but this is the thing that dominates our whole life. And so we tried to take an approach where, well, we didn't do that yesterday, but I guess we do now, and we're going to try to solve a problem for a family. And what we've learned again and again is that when we address those kinds of problems for one family, oftentimes there's a whole bunch in the background that you don't necessarily see. And so that led to that child was fully toilet trained in 10 days. We worked with our GI colleagues and came up with a protocol and published that protocol initially with 3 cases. And now we have a large 150 kid randomized clinical trial that wraps up in a couple of months. And if that's success, you know, we haven't looked at the data yet, but assuming that it's successful or hoping that it's successful, that's going to then hopefully drive best practices everywhere. And we have other projects like that that are underway. Things like, you know, someone in our previous session was asking about anxiety, and it's really difficult to identify anxiety if a child might be minimally verbal or nonverbal. And so we have a project underway where we're using wearable sensors that can detect heart rate variability, and we can identify whether or not a child is experiencing kind of like elevated heart rate and different things that are going on in their environment that might be causing that. And in particular, the folks who we're working with have identified a way to actually predict when those kinds of sensors, the data that they're getting, whether that's predicting that an episode of challenging behavior is coming. And the idea would be to give parents basically they have an app that will send them a text that says, heads up, shots fired, incoming, get ready, it's about to happen. So the parents can get ready and get the resources they need in place so that if the challenge behavior occurs, they're ready to go. So projects like that, I'm really excited about. It's the kind of thing that I know so many of the families that I work with today are like, well, what are you going to do for me today? And we absolutely have a lot of things that we try to do for the families that we serve. But it's also just really exciting to think about the next things that we can try to accomplish. One last study, and this is one that I'll plug for you. So one of the problems that we oftentimes see in our area, in our clinic, is that so many of the families that we serve are unable to access our services for challenging behavior because they have to have that kind of specific autism diagnosis, and that's really, the insurance coverage is really tied to that. And so we have a study underway now that is through the Rare Disease Network to provide the same kinds of services that we provide in our clinic remotely via telehealth through the Rare Disease Network. So any child who has kind of a genetically associated condition, developmental condition with challenging behavior can enroll in that study and receive the same kinds of services. Because what we want to try to do is extend the findings to demonstrate to payers and policymakers that lots of people can benefit from these types of services, and it isn't just if you have this really specific diagnosis.
That was inspiring to me. I think I love where we are right now with medical research and technology, and feels like there's just so many opportunities that are happening every day, and it's exciting. It's hard to keep up with all of that because there's so many new things, so many wonderful things happening. And I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit because I think part of that, what I want people to walk out of here is to know that you need to think big and have high expectations for your family members, because we don't know how things are going to change over the next years. And I think sometimes in the past, we've had a lot of professionals say, your child will never, and then list off many, many things that will never happen. And I can tell you that the number of times that they've been wrong is many. So most of the time. So please remember that your family members, you don't know what the limitations are. So think big and explore. And I just want to toss out that I think we're at we're improving in our space with advocacy and the civil rights movement for people with disabilities. So I just went to our local Disability Pride Festival last month. It was Disability Pride Month, and that's kind of a new thing in the disability community. And as I see people with disabilities starting to step up and say, hey, this is who I am, and this is what I need to be successful, like with sensory processing stuff, almost all of our cultural institutions in our town have sensory rooms. So if I get overwhelmed, I can step away and be engaged with that. They're including so many things in universal design that are going to be useful to your family members that wouldn't have been there a few years ago.
That stole my thunder.
I'm sorry.
No. What you just said is exactly a conversation I just had with someone earlier today. But that universal design thing, I mean, I've done this long enough that I remember when you couldn't purchase a sensory, a weighted blanket was many hundreds of dollars from a special place. You couldn't purchase things or even access them in any easy means. And now things are appearing. I also think it's an acknowledgement that we all regulate ourselves through sensory, we all are sensory beings, and we all need to be able to manage that in a functional way that matches our demands in life. And we may choose demands based on that. We may adjust our sensory approaches to meet demands we want to achieve. And we have to look at everybody with differences that same way. Is it a matter of adjusting, the environment through the sensory needs, or the strategies that help them manage and navigate the world to the best of their ability? And do we also shape the direction and what they may choose to do to match what is most comfortable as well? That's okay. That's why there's so many options out there. But we're not where I want to see it. Of course, we never are. But I think it's definitely rolling that direction, which creates another level of acceptance and availability, and just a good understanding of what we all really already do. We just don't think about it so much. But we also have a lot of shifting demands in our world right now. So I think just the electronic shifts, the recent shifts in the last 2 years with the virtual environment, watching how generationally kids respond to that. We have a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of potential new challenges to manage with that. So I'm excited that it's out there. And one other thing, I think that many of you, I assume, are from since these are rare things, you're all from different places, and you probably don't have a lot of wherever you receive local services may not, you may not see other children with the same condition. So we know that's rare. Therefore, the people helping your children locally where you are, this is rare for them. But from the therapeutics side of things, it's really nice to know that there is a lot out there on the same issues. There's a lot of research and at least evidence supporting how to approach the different issues. So I hope you can feel empowered to share with those that you're working with what those issues really are, so it can be broken down and not overwhelming or intimidating, because everyone's unique anyway. One person with one condition is one person with that condition. We find the similarities, but we also address the issues. So there's a lot already there for guiding interventions for those things, and much more to come. But it will continue to have that individual approach and individual need approach. So.
Okay, so let's move on and open it up to you all. So as we go through, we've got a couple microphones here in the middle of the room. So if you've got a question in the room, come up to the microphone. If it's a general question, we'll have everyone answer. If there's someone specific, we'll have one person answer, and then we'll also open it up to questions online. Come on down. The price is right.
What recommendations do you have for dealing with neurotypical siblings? So, you know, that it's one thing for me as the parent to be able to kind of monitor my child's behavior and say, oh, you know, there's something coming. I better watch out. But how can I expect my similar age child, who's a sibling of the one with the genetic condition, to be able to deal with it? It's not fair for her to have to walk on eggshells all the time. So do you have recommendations for dealing with neurotypical versus not neurotypical kids?
Sure. Want to try?
I'd love to start. So first of all, I know this was brought up in the session prior to mine. There's a sibling support network that's a national organization, and so there's places for siblings to come together and get this sort of a support. Sib shops are wonderful activities where siblings go through. For younger siblings, it's more of a play therapy, and then as you get older, it shifts. But even for adult siblings, there's a space for them to come together and share the good, the bad, and the ugly of having a sibling that's maybe not the same as some of the other kids that they know. So I think that sibling support is important. I think taking some time for the neurotypical sibling to have that space to talk, where they feel like it's comfortable for them to say what they need to say. And that might be professional counseling, but that they've got a space. None of us are happy with our siblings all the time. But there's that special need to be able to say, this is really hard, and for that to be acknowledged. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I would echo the same thing. I think that, you know, obviously there's going to be so much time and effort and attention given to the child who has unique needs. And, you know, as much as you can make it fit in your daily life, spending some time acknowledging the needs of the sibling and giving them an avenue, whether it's a peer group, whether it's, you know, getting to spend some time with grandma, whether it's one-on-one time with a parent, whether it's a therapy session, doesn't matter what it is. As long as they have some time where the focus is on them, their feelings, and where all of their feelings can be okay and validated, is really, really powerful. So giving them the venue to say, this really sucks. I don't want to have a sibling with a disability. I don't want to have a sibling who gets mad and yells. I find it scary. I find it overwhelming. And giving them the chance to communicate those things and have that be okay in whatever way works best for your family is really, really powerful.
Other questions? Jane, want to read it out?
Hi, we have a question from one of our online participants. We just got our genetic diagnosis for our child this week, still learning and trying to catch up. What are your recommendations for new families with the diagnosis?
Maybe I'll start with that one and then others can chime in. So welcome. First thing is welcome to our family, wherever you are. You're not alone. And now you know some of your friends that are here both in person and then virtually online. There are resources available. And so I'll warn you, you can search and use Dr. Google. Sometimes as you do that, you'll end up with some places that sound like gobbledygook. And especially if you're new to this, they won't make a lot of sense. I will just put a plug in for us in terms of Simon Searchlight. If you go to the website where we have with Simon Searchlight, we've tried to present that information in a way that's very accessible and understandable, but also for the more sophisticated person has the primary literature. In other words, the citations from the original medical and scientific journals where this comes from, if you want to be able to delve deeply into that. I will also say, and families out there, you can either agree or disagree. I'd love to hear your opinions. In a good way, most of the family groups have some sort of Facebook page or have some sort of social media presence to be able to join and to be able to learn from each other and post questions. And I think that people are incredibly generous in terms of being able to give advice and support. I'll also say for new individuals to these communities, that can be, I'll warn you, overwhelming, I find sometimes. And I do think in terms of skew, you'll tend to see, and again, this is, I think probably the case, you'll tend to skew in some cases on things that are problematic because people are coming with problems. But I encourage the families to also celebrate the joys, the amazing things that are going on with your children or your family members, because I think that's also part of the unique and wonderfulness of individuals. And so I just hope that it doesn't come forward in terms of a new family member or a new family to the groups as being overwhelming with all of these different problems. The advice I would give is that no one person with these conditions has all of those problems, right? They tend to have a small subset of those issues. But on the other hand, being able to get some advice about things that may come up in the future helps in terms of bringing that to the attention of your providers. And if there are any certain strategies, educational strategies in particular, hopefully you can be able to not go through so much trial and error, but build upon the prior experience of other families. So general advice. You guys, what do you think?
Yeah, I think everything you said is absolutely accurate. And I just want to add, I think it can be a very positive and a very stressful experience for a family who has had a very long diagnostic journey where maybe their child has had an autism diagnosis since early childhood, and then at some point, added an ADHD diagnosis and a intellectual disability diagnosis, and now maybe the child is 12 years old and they're getting a genetic diagnosis for the first time. And in some ways that can be a relief and feel very empowering and feel like, okay, I finally have a medical answer. I can point to where this happened on the genome. But I've also seen some families get very overwhelmed and stressed out by that and feel like, oh my God, we were doing the wrong things. We thought he had autism and he actually has high P2, and maybe I should have been doing things completely differently this whole time. And so I also want to reassure you that whatever you were doing before you got the genetic diagnosis was the right thing to be doing. The fact that your child had neurodevelopmental diagnoses, those were accurate, those described their needs and their abilities. And we're now adding on a genetic diagnosis that might help us understand some more specific things about that child. But whatever you've been doing up to this point was also the right fit for your child, even though you didn't know that specific medical diagnosis yet.
Really good point.
And the right approach for continuing. So
Yes.
you want to continue to pursue the needs that your child shows, but with more information now. And you can use that information to empower your current providers to tell them the things that you learn about through your newfound, connections about what to expect and what you may see. It just gives them a heads up on what to dig a little deeper into. And to be prepared for whether it happens or not, it just gives you and them more information. So you're kind of building your community around you that way. But great point.
Other questions, either online or in the room?
Speaking plainly, having a child with a rare genetic syndrome is expensive. What is being done to include and support those who may not be able to attend conferences like this, or even just basic doctor's offices or doctor's trips? Sometimes it takes an awful lot of those.
Great question. I hope everyone could hear. So I'll address the first portion of this, which is this conference for those individuals who couldn't attend in person. This is being recorded. You may see the camera in the back. This will be posted online. And so anyone who's able to go either at home, to their local library, any other place to watch this will have this posted and available, as well as currently it's being viewed around the world. So that's the first thing in terms of trying to increase access. It certainly is expensive, expensive in so many different dimensions. I know if you guys were actually to calculate how much missed work, how much you do in terms of not just the doctor's visit itself, but care that you need for other family members, care that you need for, or things you do in terms of special equipment you buy and other things, the costs add up enormously, not all of which are covered by insurance or by Medicaid or Medicare in terms of this. I'm going to let some of the other specialists that may have a better idea in terms of advocacy. I'm looking at you, Sharon. But I think we need to band together. This is a common problem.
Yeah, certainly I think a role professionally is for us to have a robust legislative advocacy. When it comes right down to it, laws dictate a lot of where the money is spent within our country and in other countries. And so it's really important that we're engaged. We try to engage our families to the extent that they're able and willing to participate, and our people with disabilities, because they're some of the best advocates that I've ever worked with in being able to talk about what they need to really have a good quality of life. I was going to say something else, and I wanted to talk just briefly about having trust with the medical system and early identification and diagnosis. It's very clear from the research that people of color don't get a diagnosis as early. They don't get the medical treatment. So sometimes that's financial, sometimes there's other reasons. So it's really important for us to invest resources into all kinds of communities and make sure that there's cultural competence within our staff so that we can go into all the places where people might need to get that kind of support. And build relationships and trust. And I feel really fortunate that our organization works with people throughout the lifespan, because trust can take a long time. So I've worked with some people now that are in their 30s that I met when they were 6. And so their families know what they can expect.
I'll also say, to the mic. I'll also say that there are in certain programs, either social workers or navigators or resource specialists that can oftentimes help point you in the right direction and help figure out in terms of either, for instance, being able to sign up for Medicaid or other social services. So do use those resources that some of your doctors or some of your medical centers or other programs may have.
Hi. How do we convince school districts to add additional styles of therapy for our children, like music therapy, for example? And how do we prove that it's beneficial or required for them to reach their goals more easily?
Can I start with that?
Go ahead.
Sure. So, so for those of you who weren't in my talk earlier, I gave sort of an overview of how at its core, special education is a legal process. It's not medical, it's not therapeutic, it's, the requirements are dictated by federal law, and it all trickles down to what actually happens at the school level. And so this is sort of an overly simplistic answer to you. It's a very complex question. But the answer is that in order to get schools to provide something that they're not currently providing, that requires going all the way back to the legal process and political advocacy. And first, we need to have a research base to show that these therapies are effective for a large number of kids, and it needs to be high quality research that demonstrates that these things are really going to be, frankly, financially worthwhile to the school district. And then we need to have political advocates who can talk to legislators and talk to congressmen and get these things to be part of the laws and requirements for what gets provided in a school system. On a one-to-one basis, it's going to be very, very difficult to get one individual school to provide a therapy that isn't standard and isn't something that is mandated by the laws that govern these processes.
Yeah, to that, I would add, it's important to be the squeaky wheel, right? I mean, the reality is exactly what was said. The IEP is essentially a contract, right, between the school and the family about what are they supposed to provide. And the number of times I've seen families, we have a conversation with them, we'll coach them ahead of time. We'll say, go in there and, don't take no for an answer and make sure you ask for these things that are important for your child. And then they go in there all fired up, and then they come out and they tell us a week later, yep, I totally got rolled, right? I showed up to the meeting and it felt like the meeting had already happened and I was just showing up to sign the paperwork after the fact. And there were 15 of them and one of me. And it often can feel that way, like, they are the experts and they know what's right for your child, or at least that's what they'll kind of convey. And so it is really important to, if something's really important for your child, to be able to dig in a little bit and be persistent. And there's a process. And so if the school system is in disagreement, or if there's not the resources there, there's a process where, hey, we're at a stalemate, and there's a process by which you can work through all that. Oftentimes I found some school systems have advocates that will work with you to actually help work through that process so that you're not feeling like you're on an island in the same way. And then I think the other thing is to also just recognize where the school system's coming from. It is easy to become really adversarial, and that it sometimes is necessary. Sometimes you have to be that squeaky wheel, but I tend to try to always remind folks that the school, we tend to talk about the school as though it's a monolithic organization. It's made up out of people, and it's made up of people who are generally trying to do the right thing as best they can. They have a slightly different set of priorities, right? For you as a parent, your priority is to do what's right for your child and your loved one. And that's your priority is one kid. And the school is trying to prioritize all the kids. And so that means oftentimes with very limited resources, they're trying to do as best they can for a whole bunch of kids, which sometimes means it's hard to prioritize one kid over everyone else. And so they're oftentimes coming at that from a very different position, and at least acknowledging that, like, look, I understand where you're coming from, but you got to understand where I'm coming from too. Being ready to have that conversation, seeking advocacy where you can get it. And then really just, if it's important, and that is something that is, you've got evidence that this is medically necessary, or it's educationally necessary for your child to make progress, ask them to include something like that. And then the last thing would be, a big part of the IEP process is data collection, right? They're supposed to be collecting data to demonstrate that your child's making progress. And so if nothing else, making an argument, let's try something, let's take some data, let's see if we're making progress. And if it seems like it's an important element of my child's education, we keep it, and we keep it in the IEP therefore going forward. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, I just have to piggyback on that and say that gather your forces. So have the data, the connecting of the therapy, the activity that you want to a long-term goal, or a goal within that school year, is going to be the conversation starter, so that you can have a non-adversarial conversation. If you strongly believe that music therapy is going to get you to this particular goal, you can make your case for that. You can also hear what else the school thinks may address that. If the things they suggest you're willing to try, great. And if it doesn't work, you can come back to the table and say, well, now we should try music therapy because thing A and B that you said did not work. So sometimes it's that process, but also come to the table with somebody with you. You mentioned 15 people being in the room. That's not at all uncommon. So see if there's a family support specialist. Maybe you just have a friend who would be willing to sit there and be some courage by your side, who can take notes so you don't have to, and you can focus on the advocacy.
Go ahead.
till he was like 34. So he's been kind of lost in the process over the years. He's not had the, he's bounced from school to school, therapist to therapist, medicine to medicine. So now we're in his later 30s and we're having problems with behaviors especially. And so he's not into any day programs, or he can't get into any group homes because of his behaviors. Also, he's very touchy with himself and others. And any suggestions on any of this?
Yeah, so, I mean, you talk about kind of where the problem lies, and people talk about the services cliff, right? Once your child turns 21 and they age out of what school systems provide. I work in a department of pediatrics, but prior to that, I was working in a center that I worked with a 92-year-old at one point who had challenging behavior that we worked on and we were able to be successful. And so, first of all, it's not the case that those types of interventions won't work at any particular age. That certainly the individual has a much longer history sometimes that you have to think through and grapple with. But the interventions that we talked about in our previous session can still be very effective regardless of age. At the same time, accessing those services, the folks who have that skill set and that ability to work with you, that's where things become really challenging. And it's hard to answer that question for any one family because we kind of have 50 systems, right? Every state's set up differently and every state has different services that they do and they don't provide. What I hear across the board is that there's not enough. All 50 states, everybody says it's not what we need. It's not enough of what we need. And so unfortunately, I can't give you like the magic wand that could say, well, in your state, just make this one phone call. But that's also where talking to care coordinators and other folks, waiver programs and the like, and just staying on top of those things and really, again, being that squeaky wheel. My experience, I'm in the state of Georgia and I work a lot with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, DBHDD. Again, every state has a different acronym for the group that does this kind of thing in that state. And what I hear again and again is that the families who just they will contact us and say, hey, we've got somebody who really needs a lot of help with challenging behavior. And it's always surprising to me, like I've got a kid downstairs 10 times worse than the one that they're calling me about, but there's a family member who's picking up the phone like literally every day, getting someone on the phone and saying, how are you going to help my loved one? How are you going to help my loved one? And they just continue to escalate. And those are oftentimes the ones who we get brought in to try to be helpful with that individual because they've just worked their way through the tree and they've figured out who they need to continue to call again and again and again. And it's not right. I'm not telling you that's the right way it should be. I'm a clinician by training. Like I believe this stuff should just be available because it's the right thing to do. That's not the situation that most of us live in, unfortunately, though.
I do think that it's important to point out and accentuate something you said, which is that there isn't a cliff per se. But what happens is the services aren't defined once you get out of the school system and they're not as robust. So what families of adults end up having to do is to cobble together the individual services that are going to be available to them because of the resources you have and that are going to best meet your needs. And that's part of the reason I think it's so important to get that case management, family support coordination, whatever it is that's out there so that you can say, here's what our priorities are and try and figure out how to make all the resources that are available come together for you.
Yeah, I'll just echo being the squeaky wheel. It's not fair. It's not something parents should have to do. But at the end of the day, if you call your service coordinator once a week and say, this is not tenable, I can't continue being his primary caregiver. Here are all the things that are happening that are dangerous, that are putting him and putting us at risk. And if you call and say that every single week, you might get a little bit more progress, unfortunately.
You dig a little deeper to find out what resources are out there because there are things sometimes, but that they don't advertise them. So there are sometimes those extra pieces that someone will be motivated to find. But I definitely wanted to also echo what was said about there's never a point where it's too late to intervene. And I think that is important for anyone at any point of their journey. I hear that a lot in children that come to therapy for the first time at whatever age. I always say no parent guilt here, no guilt allowed. Like everything you've done was the best you could do with what you had at the time. And you have to take the next step forward and the progress and the potential is still there in a different manner. In some ways, you have, like you said, there may be a longer history of patterns that can make a different kind of challenge, but you also have different skills and assets that a younger child didn't have, perhaps. So you build on what you have, and it's never too late to make changes, never too late for any of us to make changes in our lives. So it's just having that mindset. And then I don't have anything more to say about that battle because it's frustrating, I know, to all of us. And
I'm sorry, can I just circle back once? I do want to say that as your children get older, being able to have them recognize the connection between their actions and what they want in the future, for some kids, that can be a really important piece. So it may be important for you that he act a certain way because of this, but what is his goal for life? And if you can make that direct correlation between, I wish I had more friends, or I'd like to be able to go out and go bowling without having mom and dad around all the time, whatever it is, and then work back to, okay, in order for these things to happen, we've got to help you manage this better. And how can we help? How can we figure out how to do that? So I think that's really an important piece as well.
That's good. Go on.
I just wanted to expand a little bit on the answer to the questions about financial resources. Dr. Chung already mentioned the possibility of talking to a social worker at the hospital, at the clinic, potentially school social workers as well, can help you guide you toward resources like eligibility for Medicaid, also resources from the Social Security Administration, like supplemental security income, certainly for adults. And then my other favorite mechanism is something called ABLE accounts. About 6 or 7 years ago, I think Congress passed the ABLE Act, which set up accounts where you can save money for your child with a disability. And these accounts are a lot like the college 529 savings accounts, where you can put money, it grows tax-free. This is specifically for kids with disabilities who won't be going to college. And the money then can be used for things like housing, medical issues, job training, et cetera, and the money in those accounts don't count against your eligibility for SSI or something else like that. ABLE, A-B-L-E.
And every state is responsible to set up their own system. You don't have to choose the system in your state, but there's often benefits to doing so. It's a great program. Thanks for bringing that up.
Dr. Wong did introduce himself, but he's a developmental pediatrician and with us at the Simons Foundation. Thanks, Paul. Jane online.
Any suggestions for navigating a child's unique needs as a single parent? Single parents have to navigate without a partner, and this can feel very overwhelming.
Boy, that's such a hard situation. And, I think it's different for every family. What I think is important for everybody is to have your circle of support and your resources. And I think that can be really difficult for a single parent because you are being pulled in so many directions. So finding resources that'll give you the opportunity to take a break. Number one, if you don't have respite in your area, I hope that's available to all of you, but respite funding is key to being able to take that break. Finding other parents that you might be able to partner with so that you can get some support and work together to work through those things. And I think that really putting yourself first some of the time has to be part of your planning, because you are only one person. And if your battery doesn't get recharged, you're not going to be able to do that work for the long term. So find some support so that you can build self-care strategies, and look at what community care strategies are out there.
Absolutely. I think it takes a village. And in doing that, again, there are resources to be able to help you find, if you don't have your own social support network, to be able to do that, to help get some of those resources. I find a lot of families, in terms of using their community at church, at synagogue, at other religious affiliations, can sometimes be helpful in their neighborhood, literally their next door neighbor in their communities in that geographic location. But we're all in this together. And I mean, no one of us can do this alone. Single parent, parent with a partner, we're all in this together.
And it's also okay to do what you need to do to get through the day. Parents whether you're a single parent or in a multi-parent household, everyone holds themselves to too high of a standard. You guys are parents. You're not the therapist. You're not the doctor. You're not the teacher. And if your kid sits and watches a movie for an hour while you're making dinner, you have not ruined their development. You haven't done anything wrong. They're gonna be okay. You know, give yourself permission to do the things that you have to do to get through life.
I'm sorry. I'd also like to encourage you to be very honest with the people you do work with. Honest from the perspective of what you need, what your priorities are, and where your limits are at that moment. From the clinical side of things, we struggle with how much to give you. Some people want a lot of information and a lot of ideas and a lot of things to carry out this week, and other people are just trying to tread water, and we need to know what that priorities are. So it's perfectly okay, and it's very important that you make sure those people you're working with know kind of where you are at that time. Like, it doesn't mean we don't think you care or you're looking for enough things to do. We want to know how to help you the best in this moment right now. So what's your priority right now? What is the most important thing? If they're not asking you that question, you should be sharing that just to remind them what's important to you. What's most important this week? So that will help you the most. Go ahead.
Okay, our last question.
So it's a two-part question. The first part is, of course, we know that there's not a lot of special needs specialists in an ordinary daycare and an everyday daycare situation, which I have two kids with special needs. And transition objects don't work, and a lot of people are not familiar to take on a child with special needs, especially two of them. How do you navigate that, even giving them the information and they call you every other day to be like, hey, I need you to pick up one of your children or both of them because they're being a behavioral problem, which takes away from my job, even though, you know, you have to provide for them, but also inform the community of those things.
Oh, see, nobody wants to jump in on that. That is just such a challenge. You know, this isn't going to solve your problem, but I do want to say, I think sometimes those kinds of situations lead us to better solutions. One of the things that we provide that I couldn't be more proud of is that we do consultation in daycares, so that instead of us having our own daycare, we go out and work with daycares that provide support to hundreds of kids to try and address those supports so that we know that every kid's going to be successful there. So if those opportunities exist within your community to find out which of the daycare settings have been successful with inclusive education, how can you get through the door with them? Because sometimes those people also have access to scholarshiping and to other kinds of resources to help. And beyond that, you know, it's really hard to make that happen because capacity, daycares are understaffed like everybody else. And if I really think you have to address it at the level of they have to be able to get some resources in the door so that they don't feel like their only option is to send your child home. And those resources can't come from you. So reaching out to find out what else might be able to help. Maybe there's a behavioral specialist, maybe there's a clinician who can go in and do some training within that environment.
Yeah, it's not going to help in every situation, but one of the things you're hearing is that, you know, we have similar programs where we go into Head Start and pre-K programs and train to help allow kids to be fully included and whatnot. And that's not everywhere. But what you might find is, you know, you're hearing an example of where two places came up with roughly the same idea. Those places tend to be like university type programs. And so if you live in a state or you live near a university, especially one with a college education, special education, sometimes those types of places have the innovative programs that are trying to train people in best practices. And sometimes those are a good resource for you.
Yeah, it depends a lot on the specifics of how old your kids are and where you live and all those specific things. But there can sometimes be ways to use services in creative ways. So for example, in California, with insurance, kids can often get access to ABA services. And sometimes those ABA therapists will go into the daycare center or the preschool environment or whatever it is to provide some extra support, and we kind of cobble things together that way.
definitely keep advocating, because it's okay to say, you know, I understand you're calling me, but what other support can we look into? You know, it's okay. It shouldn't be on your shoulders. They're missing their own knowledge to that resource. So if you push and someone looks further, or if there's a different opportunity, then you create a situation where it helps not just obviously you, it helps them as well. And they will be on your side with that if they have the support they need. Surely they want more support. They just aren't realizing how to do that. So definitely keep looking, because we see, I'm sure, that in various places.
That's the center of your star. Sorry. Yeah, we can talk about that further if you'd like.
Very good. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists. You've been incredibly insightful and helpful, and I've learned a lot from you. So thanks, everyone.